The Star Wars galaxy is home to many species, at least 6 or 7, and if you look into the lore for a lot of them, you run into the idea that most have a common ancestor. One way to explain why there are so many species with a near-human appearance, and also explaining the ability for reproduction by members of different species, beyond just usual sci-fi or fantasy hand-waving. With some of the ancient parts of the timeline, though, which we've covered in some recent videos, you get a lot of examples of the Rakatans and their infinite empire in particular, shifting species around the galaxy or causing ecological changes which led to the evolution or even just direct creation of multiple species. For example, the Rakatans are directly credited with the creation of the Twi'leks species, even though there are also references to Twi'leks existing before that was claimed to have happened. Other examples of Rakatan interference creating new species came alongside a separate pastime of the Rakatans, terraforming, which they sometimes did intentionally, but also sometimes they just changed the entire ecology of a planet by accident. The Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk, for example, sometimes has its massive forest credited to Rakatan agricultural terraforming machines being left on and unattended, causing massive tree growth. Depending on when this happened in the Infinite Empire's history, it could explain the arboreal evolution of the Wookiees, since the Infinite Empire's exact timeline is both fairly broad and somewhat unclear. Either way, it definitely ends up with a very fast-paced evolution because we're still only talking tens of thousands of years for massive changes to occur. And much like the Twi'leks, it becomes a little bit problematic if you put this towards the end of the Rakatan Infinite Empire's existence, saying that maybe the machines were left on because the Rakatans disappeared, since we do have mentions of Wookiees long before this. Another example of this terraforming, though, is Tatooine, which was originally occupied by a species called the Kaminoan. The Kaminoan, who I'm going to pronounce differently every time, independently developed their own spaceflight, but like so many species of this period, they soon fell under the control of the Rakatans. When the plague which would ultimately strip the Rakatans of their ability to use the Force, and therefore use their Force-fueled technology, began reducing Rakatan power throughout the galaxy, the Kaminoan took their chance and attempted to rebel. Despite their weakened state, the Rakatan forces in the area were still able to completely glass the planet, turning it into the desert we know and love to this day. This is theorized to have divided the remaining Kaminoan population in half, with the half remaining on the surface evolving into the Tusken Raiders, while those who went underground eventually became the Jawas. This also happened kind of ridiculously quickly, given that this pretty firmly happens about 25,000 years before Yavin. It's pretty explicitly at the tail end of the Rakatan Infinite Empire's reign. But compressed timeline or not, these kinds of experiments in the creation of new species didn't end with the creation of the Republic. The Sith in particular did a lot of alchemy, creating a variety of new species like the Twi'leks, famous for their ability to like this video and subscribe for more. But beyond that, cloning and bioengineering plays a significant role throughout the modern period of Star Wars, most notably with the creation of a clone army on Kamino comprised entirely of Jango's Fett. But while we'll get back to them in a minute, the Kaminoans weren't the only cloners, and cloning experiments weren't limited to ethically questionable armies. Another world named Arcania, much closer to the galactic core than Kamino, in a region called the Colonies, was famous for cloning long before the Clone Wars, although they kept some of their more fringe experiments secret. One of these experiments involved terraforming a world about 17,000 years before the Battle of Yavin in the less explored Outer Rim into an idyllic countryside, and then they took members of the Zexto species from the planet Troikan and transported them to this new world, which would come to be called Quermia. For a few generations, the Zexto were experimented on by their Arcanian overlords, before the Arcanians decided they were done messing around and left the new offshoot Zexto to their own devices. Sadly, these experiments don't actually seem to have been that interesting. The Zexto were originally these little guys with 4 arms, but they just got turned into regular-sized guys with 2 arms, although their long necks were maintained. These new offshoots were called the Quermians, a species which most notably includes Jedi Master Yarael Poof. Because all of this experimenting was done in secret in a part of the galaxy no one really knew that much about yet, when the Quermians were discovered by the wider galaxy, it was simply believed that they shared a common ancestor with the Zexto, rather than them being the result of experiments on the Zexto. And the Quermians are almost certainly not unique in being created this way, even among more modern species. But there are a few examples of species whose experiments were more inwardly directed. Keeping up with the theme of long necks in genetic engineering, we're going to get back to the Kaminoans or Kaminoans depending on who you ask. Following calamitous events on their homeworld Kamino, the Kaminoans began selectively breeding and cloning themselves, working to genetically engineer out traits they saw as weaknesses. There are some indications they stopped directly experimenting on themselves, believing they had reached some genetic apex in the galaxy. They were very prejudiced against other species. But some of the similar practices did continue to occur, at least in some ways. Kaminoan society was organized on a caste system based largely on eye color, but green eyes in particular were seen as such a defect that individuals born with green eyes were simply killed. While not the same as the direct genetic engineering they were doing before on themselves, this is still a similar type of eugenic program. On a kind of similar note, we have the Kamites, a species from the planet Kam in the deep core, who, many centuries before the Empire, believed they had reached the apex of society, and began solely reproducing by cloning themselves, with each new generation naming themselves the same thing as their previous generation, just iterating the number after their name by 1, so you would have Dorsk, Dorsk 2, Dorsk 3, etc. It was incredibly rare for any individual to break away from their predecessors, continuing the same jobs and the same responsibilities for generations. One exception to this was Dorsk 81, meaning the 80th clone of Dorsk 1, who was tracked down by Luke Skywalker in his search for Force-sensitive individuals to train as a new generation of Jedi. Dorsk 81 ultimately decided to join Luke and become a Jedi, causing major controversy on his planet. Following his death, Dorsk 82 also learned he was Force-sensitive and went to join Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy. Neither of these examples are quite the same thing as Arcanians making a new species out of other species, but at least under a similar umbrella to the rest of what we're talking about today. Back a bit more towards the Arcanian style of genetic engineering, we have the Lurians. While these Ewok-looking guys from the planet of Lur near the modern corporate sector weren't themselves genetically engineered, they came from a planet with sparse natural resources but a wide variety of living creatures. The Lurians started by just domesticating various types of creatures to fill roles as livestock, guards, and just doing other types of duties, which I imagine looks something like the Flintstones. But over time, this developed into them directly genetically modifying these creatures to fulfill very specific tasks, like the famous Aznar, and yes, even the beloved Grebnats. This is also similar to the Yuuzhan Vong, who invaded the Star Wars galaxy and who took this several steps further by having every bit of their technology, from communication devices to spaceships, be different types of living creatures. That's going to do it for our look at some of the weird origins of Star Wars species, though. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments if there's another topic you'd like to see covered, and remember to leave a like and subscribe for more. It's always very appreciated. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.